we'll jump right into it. So, like I said, I wrote this book, the Book of Dubue, and it all started back when, going back in history, I always knew I was adopted. And I was always told growing up, that my mother, my natural mother, was a young mother. She was only 16. I was told all that. And then my adoptive mother, whether she presumed some stories, but she'd always said, oh, your mother was whisked away to an unwed mother's home. That's where she had you and gave you up for adoption. That was somewhat true. But as it turns out, that my real mother was 16. She'd gotten pregnant during high school, and my natural father has never known of my existence. Although I'm telling you this story, I found out who he is actually. Although that family has no idea that I exist. My mother's side of the family, we'll get into that. I've met a lot of them. I come from a very large family, and I met some of them over the last, I guess, couple of years now, year and a half. I've had the opportunity to meet some of them. I discovered that I have some half, brothers and sisters from my mother's side. I've met Mike, and I've talked to Debbie, and there's a few others that I haven't actually met them yet. But as far as my father's side goes, they were never told. My natural father was never told that I existed because my mother was only 16. She kept it to herself. She gave me up for adoption. Got to think back in 1959. That was, it's at any like even in today, it's, people having mothers having babies at a young age. Not that it's unacceptable, but people try not to do that. They try to avoid it. Anyway, back then, she decided to give me up for adoption, and that's what happened. And she kept it a secret. It turns out that she ended up living with her sister, my Aunt Lucy, who we'll get into that bit of the story a little later. But she came from a very large family of 12 siblings. And there's only 3 surviving now. Unfortunately, my natural mother has passed on, so I never got the opportunity to meet her. But I don't really want to talk, we're going to be talking about the birth of the Dubue clan, because it's a relatively new name. And we're going to be talking about some history, like the history of the family, because going back, like the book, when I started doing the research, which all started with my wife giving me a DNA program. I'm not going to get into which one it was, but I had my DNA done, and it researched my ancestry, and I ended up discovering some things out of that, about 2,000 matches actually. That in combination with what my adoptive mother gave me before she passed on. She had given me my original adoption papers. And that's where I'm going to start this book. So this is like the first chapter in the series. I think there's maybe going to be 4 or 5 videos. We'll see as we go along about that history. So, like I said, my mother was 16, gave me up for birth. Like I can almost read off what I wrote here. I call it the journey. Like the first chapter in the book is basically called the journey. I'm going to follow along the book per se, not necessarily in order, because the book itself is not what I'm presenting. I'm presenting the story. I'm telling my story essentially. So if I go back to pre-2009, because I can't remember the exact year that my adoptive mom gave me my adoptive papers, but growing up, I never really had I always knew I was adopted, but I never had any interest or the urge to find my birth family. It wasn't a priority. But it only came a priority recently, back in 2018 for Christmas. Like I said, my wife had given me a DNA program where I could research my ancestry through DNA. So I did that. But then I went back to my adoption papers that my mother had given me. And I had, going back, it's probably 10 years ago now, my wife and I had taken a course through the Children's Aid about adopting. We were going to adopt a family member. That didn't turn out. But at that time, I decided to request my original adoption papers. And I got a profile from them that described the adoption process that my natural mother went through, giving me up. And there was a family history. It talked about And in the book, like this is part of there's a profile here that they gave me, so I highlighted in the book where they did, and they can see it's been redacted because they don't give you the natural birth name. They kind of give you a story. Like there were 12 siblings, and it kind of goes through about who the siblings were. And there was a brother aged 24 years and single. He had light brown hair and blue eyes. There's a sister aged 22 and married. Weighed 120. It describes a little bit of each person. But no names except for my Uncle Roy. For whatever reason, they didn't redact his first name. So that's the only name I got out of the 12, and the fact that there was 12 siblings. But along with that, they give a little bit of social history, and they tell you in that profile from CAS, they tell you about. So the process gives you, a brief history of the siblings, the parents, the family background. It also states that my birth father was not told about me. Just said that he was also a high school student, a couple of years older than my mother, that he liked to dance, and he was into sports and that sort of thing. But he had no idea of my existence. So I had that to work with. But then along with the actual adoption papers from my mother, which I have here, for whatever reason, they didn't redact my full birth name, Joseph Bernard Patrick Dubue. So I had two things. I had the last name, I had the size of the family it came from. But back when I was first given these by my mother, my adoptive mother, I checked the phone book and the name Dubue didn't pop up for whatever reason. And like I said, I wasn't all that interested at the time of looking. But then, about a year and a half, 2 years ago, when I got the ancestry DNA thing from my wife, I took a big interest in it for some reason, and I started researching it, and then I started creating a profile online, searching for my ancestors. Because one of the things that my daughter, one of the things that it used to always come up when I talked to my daughter, and she'd always ask Dad, like, "What's our medical history?" When you're adopted, you don't know what your natural medical history is. So my daughter would always ask me, and that was one of the reasons where I thought, well, it would be good to know what our medical family history is. So that was one of the reasons. But when I actually started diving into the research, like I said earlier, I started researching, trying to find the family. I got more excited, more interested because I was finding information. So, and then part of this story, I guess today's video is going to be about the initial research and what I found, and taking that information that I had gotten, from the Children's AIDS profile, and the name that I had discovered through the actual adoption papers. As I was researching, I was having a hard time finding a family with 12 siblings, and nothing was really popping up or matching. And then I discovered one that had 5, but there were a couple of deaths in the family that I said, wow. So I started researching newspaper clippings, and I came across a newspaper clipping of a couple of, of a family that I thought, well, maybe it matches. I wasn't sure. There was only, I thought there was only 5, and I researched the family clipping. Now it's unfortunate that sometimes you discover stuff through a tragedy, because as it turns out that I came from a family of 12 where there were 12 aunts and uncles, but I discovered them through the obituary of 2 brothers who had drowned, Richard and Raymond, my uncles. And I found this obituary in the Ottawa Citizen, I believe it was the Ottawa Citizen. And as I was reading the obituary, it listed off 12 siblings, all with their names. And then I thought, well, I'm going to start plugging the names in with the last name that I found in the obituary. And boom, I thought, because there were no other records that I could find where there was a family of 12 in Ottawa. And so I discovered this family. So I started plugging the names in, trying to create this answer. And within a couple of hours. I had, I was about 2 generations deep in ancestry, fairly significant ancestry. And I thought, like, wow, like I found, like, unfortunately through an obituary. Now the story of Richard and Raymond, which is sad in itself, like it's really, it's unfortunate. They actually were in a drowning accident. Roughly, I think it was about 2 months after I was born. I had already been given up for adoption, and unfortunately, the two boys were playing after supper, as the story was told in the Citizen, that they were down by the Ottawa River, the end of, I think, near Sterling Avenue, I think, if I remember correctly, and that they were, whether they were fishing or whether they were horsing around with their friends, but for whatever reason, I believe it was Raymond, fell into the water. And at that point, there's some kind of a whirlpool hole where he was getting sucked down. And his brother jumped in to try and help him, and they both got sucked down, and they both drowned, really tragically. And I remember talking to Uncle Roy, who's one of the surviving members of what I call the Dubue Dozen. And in the next video, we'll talk a little bit about that story of the Dubue Dozen, the family, that history of that part of the family that I came from. And it brought back some memories for him that it was hard for him at first to hear about, because it reminded him of what happened. But that's how I discovered the family, was through an obituary, through the Ottawa Citizen. So I discovered this family of 12 siblings. And then I went on from there. I was building the history. And then I came, and then there were DNA matches, and there were several high profile DNA matches that I came across. And one of them was, there were several, and I'll talk about Karen, and hopefully maybe in the next video I'm going to ask Karen maybe if she'll want to maybe come on and talk with me about it. We'll see. Don't know yet because I actually haven't asked her. But I discovered Karen, and I sent out an email request to Karen, a few different sources, and she responded. And told her a little bit of what I had found and what it was, because it turns out I was the family secret that she didn't know about. And she was curious enough to ask more questions, and we started chatting back and forth by email. And then we started talking on the phone. And then she went and she reached out to like I said, I have 4 brothers and a sister from my mother's side, from her, because she got married shortly after I was born. Like the next year, she actually married a fella and got married and had more kids. And so she talked to my younger brother, who would be the oldest in that family, Mike. And she reached out to Mike, and then that process took a few weeks before, because he was traveling, he was going on whatever. And we finally connected online through that. And then it progressed from there, where then I found out that, I have 4 other siblings, Debbie, which is a sister, and then 3 brothers. Unfortunately, one of the brothers had passed away now 2 years ago now, or 3 years. So Gord and David I haven't met. Stephen unfortunately passed away. So I have these siblings from my mother's side that I've never known, but Mike and I have now been in contact quite a bit over the past year. We've chatted back and forth, FaceTime, and all that kind of thing. But due to COVID, we were supposed to all get together this fall, but because of COVID, we had to cancel that. But hopefully that at some point will come around. But also in discovering the family, like there's my father's side, which when I was researching the book, I had no idea. Like I had DNA matches that I was coming across, and I figured they have to be from my natural father's side of the family. But I had no idea who they were, no real connections. But as it progressed, as more information was coming through the ancestry profile that I was using, I won't get into which one I was using, but other people were also, like many people research their ancestry through whatever platform they're using. There were other people I discovered, and I figured out and I found who I'm like 99% sure who my natural father was. Unfortunately, he's also passed away. And I haven't approached that family yet. I was always hoping that they would see the DNA matches and contact me, because they were all doing DNA matching as well. And it turns out that I have 3 sisters from my father's side. So I have a lot of siblings. that I'm, in the process of discovering throughout this story. But the Book of Dubue, because I did a lot of research on the Dubue side, I discovered a lot about the family history, which ironically, a lot of the family doesn't really know about. Now, some of them do, because when I discovered the history and I let them know that I was doing this research, and at first, my first inclination was just to do a poster, do a family tree poster. But then I started finding all these stories and it got more elaborate. So I told myself, I'm writing a book about this stuff. And some of them were interested in the book. Now, there were some that weren't, and that's fine. The book was never presented for sale, right? But so basically, I created this book, and those who chose to participate or buy, they paid a cost what it cost to develop the book. And it wasn't a cheap venture. It was about, I don't know, $2,500, $3,000, somewhere around there. There's about 30 copies. I made for it, but 30 copies were distributed to the family of the ones who could afford or wanted to spend the money buying the book to have the stories for themselves. So I created this book that has all the family history. It has a section at the back that where they can, it's like an heirloom piece. There's places where they can have a scrapbook section, keep notes, that sort of thing. Something that they could hand down to their kids and whatever. So it's like an heirloom piece. And that was for the family. But the stories are so unique. And I'm sure for those who really get into discovering what their ancestry is, like mine took going through an adoption and all that, but anybody looking for the history of their family, there's some really neat stories you'll find. Like we found that there are some significant people in our past that were part of our story, going all the way back to royalty. I traced it back. Now you could really spread out for where there are, tens of thousands of people in your tree. Like there's maybe, I don't know, there's a couple thousand people in this one. But it goes all the way back into the 900 ADs where there's actually royalty, which many people can say the same thing. At some point you came from somewhere, right? So, but I found some royal lineage. I found Prussian lineage. I found people that were knights and all that. So those are the stories that I want to talk about. And some significant figures in our Canadian history of people that are in our ancestry. So in the next several segments of this show, I want to talk about some of those stories. So, and for the benefit too of like those family members who weren't able to buy the book but some were actually, could you tell us the stories? And I said, well, I didn't want to reveal anything in the beginning, but for those who didn't buy the book, well, now they're going to learn some of the stories. They can watch the video and learn some of the stories. The idea wasn't, have them buy it, but the idea was for, to share the history. And I'm going to do it now through video, and hopefully they enjoy some of the stories that I found, and whether they want a book or not, that doesn't matter. It wasn't, the book was more for me and for those who wanted to participate in it, and that was fine. I got really excited about developing the book, and then I found all kinds of cool stuff. So today's video was about the introduction, the journey, what started the process, and then what I will do in the next section, or the next chapter of this. See, there's the journey called In the Beginning, where I talk about my adoption. I talk about the genealogy and the migration, because I get into that as well. I'm about I'm 30% French, 30% Irish, 30% English, and then there's a little bit of European influence from different, like Norwegian influence, whatever. But most of our ancestry actually comes from France. And then they migrated over across the river to into Britain and into Ireland and things like that. But then there's some cool fun facts that I'll talk about in the next section. I'll talk to you about the Knights of the Order and that kind of thing, some of the British ancestry, and then the history of the Dubue name is it's only 3 generations old, and there's a story behind that as well, the discovery and the creation of the name. And then I also know the creation of the coat of arms and the original family name, because Dubue is not the original family name. So I'll talk a little about that in the next video. I don't want to tell it all. There's too much information to do in it would be a 2-hour video, or 2.5, 3-hour video as include everything. So I'm going to break it down into, whether it's 5, 10, 15, 20-minute chunks, and you'll discover my journey in the story and the interesting characters that I discovered in my history. So it's not a book about a family tree, but these series of videos are about the interesting stories of historical figures that I found in my ancestry. And that'll be how we go about this. This is today's video, and I hope you stay tuned for the next video where I'm hoping maybe I'll talk to a few of my family members. They might want to get involved, talk about their experience on this side of it, or not. I don't know yet, because this is today's show and it's off the cuff. Like I said in my previous one, a lot of my stuff I do off the cuff. It's what I'm doing that day or that week. Right now I'm looking to, what am I going to talk about this week? Well, I'm decided to talk about my family history and my true roots of where I came from. So this series is going to be called The Book of Dubue, A Family History, but it's the historical stories that I really want to focus on. So I hope you enjoyed today's quick little video, and you look forward to the continuing story of the Dubue saga and my history and my deep ancestral history, because that's really what we're going to be talking about. Some of these stories are centuries old. It'll be fun. As always, I hope you're having a great day and you keep crushing it. Stay tuned.